All right, welcome to another open source office hours. This week we're going to kick it off with a couple announcements and then get into questions as usual. So Nate, you want to say what you have to say?
Yeah, sure. So the big ask obviously has been documentation. We also have a lot of people joining the Lever team soon, so also really relevant to us internally. And so I started working on it a little bit. We're using HackPad. I'll post a link. And I just made a DerbyJS.hackpad.com. If anyone wants to join as a collaborator, let me know. And basic plan for the documentation, I realized it was just kind of hard to start. This is a really big project and publish it all at once. So I'm going to write it in the HackPad, and I started with an outline. So it'd be great to get feedback on the outline actually, and what's missing, and then we'll take that. And the idea is that since we'll be writing the documentation in the HackPad, you can immediately use it, and eventually we'll port it all to the website. But the nice thing about HackPad is it lets you write Markdown, and so it'll be pretty portable to the site. But it just makes it easier for me to iterate quickly, and it's like collaborative editing.
Nice.
And one day we'll write our own documentation engine on Derby, but for now this is great and much easier, and it works.
Cool.
Yeah. And then the other thing that we did at Lever is we used to have one blog for Lever. We broke out all of the stuff that's about engineering or team culture and open source stuff into a separate blog. So it's now at inside.lever.co. And our name for our blog is called Mechanical Advantage, which is just a cool sounding term. So that is where we're going to post office hours links in the future, and also as we're blogging about Derby, I'm probably just going to get rid of Derby having a separate blog because it's too much to maintain, and I haven't updated in forever. So we'll just blog here, and so stuff about open source will be on this blog.
Also, you hooked up the examples are now hosted at real URLs, right?
Yeah, the Derby examples had some. We just didn't set up varnish fully, so they now have proper subdomains. If you go to chat.derbyjs.com, it works now. There's definitely still some bugs with them, and I need to add links back into the documentation now that all the stuff's back up. And there's still some bugs with the examples, but at least they're on the internet again. Big progress.
Also, Artur shared a pretty cool tutorial in the Derby mailing list recently, which goes through adding a login flow to simple to-do example that I think you made, right, Pavel?
No, it's some other guy. But yeah, but the tutorial is pretty cool. It's about how to use the to-do application. So it kind of involves the previous tutorials that Artur wrote previously, and we published it in English. So it grabs the to-do tutorial and it improves it by adding the login and the access control. So it uses it shows how to properly use the ShareJS plugin and how to protect your data.
Yeah, it's very cool. Also, in other tutorial land, I looked into updating the to-do MVC example for the to-do MVC project itself, which is more focused on the actual client side of the example. So I started working on that last night. I will probably submit a pull request to get that updated sometime soon.
Nice. Cool. So
the version there is really old. It's like Derby 0.3. It's kind of sad.
All right. So I think that's it for announcements. We can move on to questions. And Pavel, you said you had a question, right?
Yeah, one No, pretty simple questions. So recently I tried to, so I don't know how was it working before. I tried it like in version 0.5. I tried to create a reference and create it inside of the already subscribed document. And before it did not work, but somehow like now it started to work right. So even if I try to create a reference inside of like I first subscribe for some document, for example like a user, and then inside the user I create like a some reactive function, and I bind an output of this reactive function into the subpath of subscribed user.
Yeah,
Will
that
it work actually? So is it right to do this or not?
it probably does work, but it really is a bit sketchy. The way that code works is a little simpler than it used to be, so I'm not surprised that it actually works now. But basically the problem with the reaction flow is that it's all very imperative. So when you edit something, then Derby emits an event, and then when that happens, it often emits other events, because the way that refs work is basically when you edit something, then it also immediately edits it in a second location, and then it emits an event as if the thing happened at both locations. That's just kind of like the low level of how events work. And then a lot of stuff responds to those events. So the way that the reactive function works is they see the event, and then they like rerun those functions, and then they output something, and then they do another mutation. And the problem with all this stuff reacting on top of each other is that you can get into cycles where something reacts to itself, or you can get into tricky situations where it actually appears that the things happen in a different order because of just like the imperative nature of event emission. So if something responds to an event that causes something else to respond to an event, and like you look at what gets called in what order, because the functions are getting called in the middle of the event emission, it's kind of hard to, I've never figured out a way to articulate this, but it's actually basically as if in some ways the things happen in a different order than they actually did from the perspective of different code, because the call was in the middle of some code that was already executing. That's really not an easy to understand explanation, but to make a long story short, this shit's complicated. So it's very hard to reason about what's like safe and what's not. So this is actually, interestingly enough, I've been reading, the Facebook team published a concept, I guess, or an architecture called Flux. And it's documented alongside React.js. And the basic idea behind Flux, I was just reading it over again yesterday because I was doing research on documentation of other frameworks. And the basic idea is that information should flow in one way, and that you should only update stuff one at a time, and then wait for it to propagate everywhere before you mutate the model state again. And more or less, having things react to themselves internally can break that flow. So I'm not surprised it works, actually, but what you'll probably find is it'll break at some unexpected moment, and you'll shoot yourself in the foot, and you'll be very angry and confused. So I would not do it because it'll like break at the unexpected moment. And that's kind of Facebook's whole point with Flux, is like these kind of really complicated things tend to break in ways that are hard to predict. And then you can delve in and figure out why they broke, but it's just not, you're setting yourself up for failure if you do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, like it's. I think that it's a bad idea to try to do it. But it's interesting that it works, because it did not work previously at all. It was throwing some kind of an error whenever you just try to bind an output of the reactive function into like fetched document. But now it works, and it allows you to do it, and it actually kinda like works right. So it's just strange.
It works right, but yeah, it'll fail in some unexpected situation, and then you'll be angry. So that's what
yeah.
It's just complicated. frankly. What might have changed is I changed the way that refs work internally to, what I realized is that they're much more read heavy, because typically we're doing a lot more rendering and updating and reevaluating than we are setting. So it used to be that refs did not update the computed data immediately. They would do it in a lazy fashion, which is optimized for reducing the amount of time you're mutating stuff. But in fact, it's very fast. So I changed the code internally to update immediately, which is probably why it works now, actually. But what you might end up happening is if you, in ShareJS, if you modify something synchronously in an event emission. So this is for the same exact reason. If a document emits an event that's like, hey, this got changed, and then in that callback to that event, you mutate that same document, ShareJS will throw and say, like, you can't do that because of the whole ordering problem. In the middle of the event emission, the change hasn't been fully applied yet. And so it's kind of like you're halfway between a version, and you need to wait until you're fully resolved all the events before you can mutate it again. Otherwise, the state of ShareJS internally will get really screwed up. So it could have been either of those two things that caused the thing that you're seeing, and your specific situation might have avoided those, but would not rely on that behavior working.
Okay, thanks.
If anything, I'd like to put in more restrictions around these kind of things than forever, because it looks great at first, and then you later discover that your code is broken and you have no idea where to look. So that's why to avoid these kind of patterns.
Yep, that's right. Okay. And actually, I remembered another kind of question that we have discussed recently.
Yeah.
Well, I found it just recently that it's about how the components works. It's about how to pass arguments into components compared to passing arguments into templates. So like as the documentation says, you can access the arguments that you have passed into the template by using the @ sign, right?
Yes.
But if you pass an argument into a template which is actually linked to a component, so you basically you try to run the component template, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, you can access those arguments without an @ sign, right?
Yes, this is a good question. So I hate this. I really wish this were not so complicated. So it's a long story why it is the way it is, and it's too complicated, and one day I hope to make it simpler, but this is the simplest I've gotten so far. So the reason for this is that when you pass stuff into a component, what it actually does is it copies the value into the locally scoped model of the component, which is handy so that you can reference it inside of the JavaScript associated with that component. So the other reason it does this is that if you mess with the model inside the component, you can use that name inside the component template, and that name is scoped to that component. So it's efficient to access that data, and it's also like very clean code to say like, oh, here's some internal state in this component. I just want to like have this name or something that I generated in JavaScript, and then I can render it in the component, and it's just that name without any symbols or anything. And the reason that @ still exists is actually more of a side effect of how the naming works for attributes for views that aren't components, because they don't have a locally scoped model. The @ is there to like access the actual attribute value, and they're slightly different but really similar, so it's really confusing. I've been trying to figure out how to get rid of the @ thing, actually.
Yeah, well, actually, like it makes sense the way you did it, because like you just pass some arguments into the local model of these components, and yeah, like it's a natural thing that you want some sub templates inside of these components, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, like you don't have any other like efficient way to access the fields from the local model of the component from these sub templates, right?
Yes.
Because like otherwise, like you'll need to do some kind of a like weird thing with like passing those arguments again into the sub templates inside of a like component
Right.
like view file, right? And it's going to be too bloated. So yeah, like I guess the only thing is how to get rid of the @sign completely.
Yeah, so I actually went through a long evolution on this one, and actually may be able to. But I also realized you could probably get rid of the hash sign, but I think I kind of like the hash sign, so I was debating this. So the place that it came from was it's easier if it starts with an @ to know that you have to look it up as an attribute. And the way that I used to pass in when I started this has evolved over time. And when I started this, the way that I passed the stuff in was by rendering the current value. So in 0.5, this shit was complicated, but in 0.6, there's a type of object called a template type that other things inherit from. And basically, if you pass a template to a view, like if you store the template in the model, and you can actually get the template in your component if you call this.getView, it'll return the template, which can be handy because then you can pass around the template itself. Or if you pass in with like in your template file, if you pass in some HTML, it'll actually pass it in as a template, not as a rendered value. That way it can render it whenever it needs to render it, and if the values of stuff inside of it change, it can do that. And if it needs to have bindings inside of it, it can do that. So it's passed around as a template. And if you were to call model.get in the component, you'd actually find that you'd get a template object. You wouldn't get the value. So this is something that kind of evolved. And at first, I tried to render it initially. So it would store the string of the rendered text in the model instead of the template, and realized that actually caused more problems and was less flexible than just putting the template in there and then giving you functions to render the template in the component. So there's a way to render the templates instead. And so you can call get attribute, which basically renders the template. So, make a long story short, I think that, given all that, it may actually be possible to rewrite the code so that if the attribute is defined, it would get the attribute, and if not, it would assume it's not an attribute and it's in the model. But I haven't really gone back and made sure that covers all the bases. So I may be able to get rid of the @ The @ is super confusing.
Yeah. I have kind of a related question to that. So I'm still trying to internalize this model. When you pass in a bound variable, right, like a path, as an attribute to a component, then it's not a template in the model, right? Like it's a
yeah, the way that works right now. And I'm still trying to make it better, but the way that works right now is if it is a literal value, like if you pass in if you say x equals 1, like this, then that actually just passes in the number 1, and it's just literally a number type. It gets set in the model. It's also the attribute is a number. If you say x equals, say y, and what it'll do is it'll create a reference from y to x inside of that component. So it's actually creating a model.ref. That way, if you modify x, it'll update y. If you modify y, it'll update x. Just creates refs. If you do something like x equals y of z, if you use square brackets, currently this is incomplete. It's actually a pretty significant bug in a way. If you say, if you do some sort of property access like this, it is possible to create a ref to that because you can basically look up the current value of z on y, then create a ref to the path, which is y dot, foo, if z is foo. And that will basically establish the ref initially. But what it won't do is keep it up to date if z were to change. So this really requires a rewrite of the bindings layer, which is kind of a shit show right now. The current hack to get around that is you can use an on block around that. So if you put in a mustache, you put like on z around that. That will actually re-render the whole template section whenever z changes. So it'll like re-establish that, but that's a super ghetto hack, and you shouldn't have to re-render the whole component just because of that. So it's kind of shitty. But that is one hack you can do at the moment. I just basically did all this stuff and then got to the end and went, oh, wait a second, like bindings need to be rewritten. It was like, that's why there's still some bugs with these complicated cases. And then there's one more case that is if the thing is something which is not resolvable to a path and not a literal value, then it creates a template. So if you're to say that x is like, say like y, and then also we say like put some stuff in there, that is a template because really that's all Derby can do is pass that in as like another template. So that's why sometimes it's a value, sometimes it's a ref, sometimes it's a template, because it's sort of like whatever is the most useful thing that Derby can do with it is what it currently does. I've debated whether it makes sense for this behavior to be automatic like it is, because it's like somewhat unexpected that these things are slightly different. But it's like a question of, do I add more complexity to the syntax so that you express all these things explicitly? Or do you just do what's like really intuitive, which most of the time kind of makes sense when you look at it. You're like, oh, I see why that's what it is. So for now, I've gone with like less syntax. And that's kind of why it's a bit confusing at first. I'm not sure if it's better or worse. But it makes for good-looking code if you understand like why the different things are the way they are. And once the bindings are fixed, like the reason why this is frustrating right now is that in some of these situations the bindings don't fully work. So if the bindings were to all work like you'd expect, then I don't think people would run into problems like this as much.
Nice.
Some of these bindings are very confusing.
And also, when you create a template out of the expression that you can't bind, that you can't ref, so this template is bound to some context, to the current like context of the current component, where you try to pass to evaluate the view name.
Yeah, so that code is pretty tricky to get right, actually. The way that works is the name, it kind of looks like it should. So the name is what the name is where I wrote the code, basically.
Yeah.
Much like Clojure in a way. But sometimes you actually want the name to be the name where it's rendered, which is crazy. So, but actually very useful. So there's another way you can do that. There's an alternate way of defining attributes, which is called the attribute tag, or you can say like attribute.
Oh, that's cool. New frontiers of Derby. Oh, nice.
There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things. I'm actually thinking about changing some things in the syntax here slightly, because we use the word name, and I sort of want to use the word is, but that's going to piss everyone off. It's going to be a breaking change. So I might not do it to the next version. So let's see. It's like attribute name equals that I think you put inside of it. But hilariously, I'm forgetting my own syntax. So I think you can do this if I recall correctly. And the interesting thing is if you, so this is like the same thing. I just rendered Y. But if, well, actually that's the string. That's UI. But then if I wanted to have it use the name Y where it's rendered, there's a thing called within. If you add within, then instead of using the name Y where I wrote it, it'll use the name Y where it's rendered.
Whoa, that's cool. Okay.
It's actually really useful. We've used it before. Also, if you just have, so if you, when you define your component, you say like, you can say attributes equals, you probably know this, but maybe not. So when you define your, component, you can give it named attributes, like that. You can say attributes equals and then space separated list of attribute names. So that way you can use the attribute syntax with just the name. So I can have just like X and X in my template. So it's the same thing, it's just convenient. Like, sort of like element equals.
Great.
Lets you make things that look really pretty. You can have like fancy stuff that is like special tags, effectively. So yeah, so that is that's some fancy pants advanced templating stuff. There's also some pretty cool features and components for extending them in various ways and inheriting various attributes and stuff like that. So this is a whole big topic for a guide. So a note on the documentation. I broke it up into 3 sections in my outline. The first part is like marketing/intro. So it's basically like on the homepage and like sort of sub-pages of the homepage. I want to have, you know, people are always like, what is Derby? Why is it different than other frameworks? Like, what should I care about? What can it do? What can it not do? So it's just like, should I even care? And then the next section is mostly about best practices. So it's conceptually, how do I use components? Not necessarily documenting the full API, and then an API reference section. So that's kind of how I'm outlining it right now. So basically, I need a guide on how to use, how to pass attributes around. I should actually make that a explicit thing.
Yeah. Well, I've tried to take as best notes as I can, so they'll be in the blog post as well. So fresh memory.
Say it's
Cool. Well, it's about time to get back to work, I think. So I think we can wrap it up here then, and you know, we'll be posting this up on the blog, and then continuing to work on the documentation, and we'll be same time, same place next week, right?
Okay, sounds good.
Good to see you, Paolo.
Yep. See you, Nate. Jan, bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.